The Viking Age left an indelible mark on Ireland, shaping its history, society, and culture for centuries to come. Beginning in the 9th century, the Vikings launched relentless attacks on the island, targeting its wealthy monasteries, bustling ports, and prosperous towns. While the Danes wreaked havoc in England and France, Norse raiders made Ireland an almost perpetual battleground, establishing powerful strongholds and thriving trading hubs along its coast. At the heart of Viking activity in Ireland were ports like Dublin, Limerick, and Wexford, where the Norse established their bases of operations. These ports became centres of trade, wealth, and power, attracting both settlers and merchants from distant lands. However, the Vikings' primary business in Ireland was slavery, and they scoured the island for captives to supply their lucrative trade. As a response to the Viking threat, Ireland's kings grew more militant, and her various clans found common cause under the High King, who led the charge against the Norse invaders. Historian John Haywood aptly noted that few places suffered more at the hands of the Vikings than Ireland. For nearly 2 centuries, Norse raiders terrorized the island, carrying away untold numbers of men, women, and children to supply their slave trade. While the Vikings managed to establish a few long-term strongholds on the Irish coast, they never succeeded in conquering significant stretches of territory. This failure can be attributed, in part, to the unique political landscape of Ireland during the early medieval period. Ireland was a patchwork of some 150 small kingdoms and a dozen overkingdoms, each ruled by a king responsible for the prosperity and safety of his people. These kings wielded considerable power as lawmakers, judges, and military commanders, and their authority extended over extended kin groups or clans. The wealth of these kingdoms was measured in livestock and land, which the kings were duty-bound to protect. While smaller kings owed tribute to their overkings, the true power of an overking lay in his ability to command the loyalty of client kings. However, the decentralized nature of Irish politics presented significant challenges for the Vikings, who sought permanent conquest. Most Viking raids on Ireland were carried out by raiders of Norwegian origin, who arrived via the Northern Isles and the Hebrides. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland occurred in 795, when Norsemen sacked the monastery at Recru, modern Rathlin Island. Over the following decades, fleets of Viking longships descended upon Ireland's eastern coast, using its rivers to plunder the island's numerous monasteries and settlements. Despite their military prowess and advanced seafaring technology, the Vikings faced stiff resistance from the Irish, who were adept at guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics. While the Norse had the speed of their longships, the Irish had the advantage of surprise and local knowledge. Moreover, the decentralized nature of Irish society made it difficult for the Vikings to establish permanent control over large swathes of territory. Ambitious kings and warrior chieftains constantly vied for power, leading to shifts in alliances and loyalties. The impact of Viking raids on Ireland's Christian heritage was profound. The island had been Christianized since the 5th century, and its monasteries were centres of learning, wealth, and culture. Irish monks played a crucial role in spreading Christianity across northern Britain, but their way of life was threatened by the marauding Norsemen. Terror gripped the monks within their monasteries as they prayed fervently for divine intervention to repel the Viking invaders. In Ireland, the Vikings went from being raiders to conquerors throughout the course of the 9th and 10th centuries. They established fortified towns and challenged the authority of Irish monarchs during this time period. The Vikings launched their invasions of Ireland in the latter part of the 8th century, with the first attack being documented as taking place on Rathlin Island in the year 795. The Vikings robbed wealth and seized slaves during these early assaults, which chose monasteries and coastal villages as their targets. Because they were dispersed among a large number of smaller kingdoms, known as Tuatha, the Irish did not have a centralised power that could effectively combat the Viking menace. These individuals, on the other hand, were bound together by a common sense of identity and a ferocious determination to fight back against foreign invaders. Orgil, who the Irish referred to as Targesius, or the Devil, was one of the most important figures in the Viking conquest of Ireland. He was also well known as the Devil. In the year 839, Orgil commanded a fleet and erected the first Viking longport, often known as a fortified camp, on the shore of Lough Neagh. This was accomplished by navigating the river Bann into Lough Neagh. It was at this point that the Vikings made a significant adjustment in their strategy, moving away from hit-and-run attacks, and instead establishing a permanent presence in Ireland. Orgil's fortified camp served as a foundation for additional Viking invasions into the heart of Ulster, which demonstrated the Vikings' intention to capture and occupy Irish territory, also known as Irish territory. In the year 840, Orgil launched a daring assault on St. Patrick's Monastery in Armagh, which served to illustrate the destructive nature of Viking warfare. Orgil personally led the assault that resulted in the destruction and vandalism of the monastery, which is a representation of Ireland's spiritual and cultural legacy. Orgil's reputation as one of the most vicious Viking chieftains, who was hated by the Irish folk, was cemented as a result of the booty that he received from the invasion. In the year 841, Orgil erected a second longport in a strategic location on the east coast of Ireland. This place would subsequently become the location of the city of Dublin. With the help of this fortified village, the Vikings were able to establish a safe base from which they could undertake additional raids and significantly spread their dominance throughout the region. The Vikings continued to assert their authority over the Irish people, taking advantage of internal conflicts and rivalries among the Irish people, despite the fact that they were met with resistance from Irish monarchs and clans. On the other hand, Orgil's aspirations were cut short in the year 845, when he was murdered by Moll Shacmel, the Irish ruler of Meath, under unknown circumstances. Even though the specifics of Orgil's passing are still unknown, there are several stories and legends about him. Despite the fact that we do not know how this occurred, the Welsh churchman Gerald of Wales, who wrote about it centuries later, tells a fascinating story about it. According to Gerard, Thorgil received a communication from Moll Shacmel in which he demanded the hand of his daughter in marriage. Despite the fact that Malshekar agreed, he instead dispatched a group of young men without beards who pretended to be his daughter and her maidservants. As soon as the future bride and her companions were brought before Thorgil, the young people took off their disguises and slaughtered the Viking chieftain and his troops. With successes in fights against Viking invaders, the Irish exhibited a tenacious resistance against Norse intrusions. This resistance was highlighted by their victories. There were 4 key wars that took place in the year 848, and the Annals of Ulster recounts how Irish soldiers emerged victorious, inflicting huge fatalities upon the Viking Empire. Irish warriors adhered to an ancient Celtic tradition of collecting enemy heads as trophies rather than taking prisoners. This practice was known as head collecting. The conquest and sacking of Dublin by Moll Shacmel in the year 849 resulted in the departure of a large number of Norse settlers, which briefly reduced the influence of the Vikings. The arrival of two Norwegian brothers named Olaf and Ivar in the year 853, on the other hand, completely altered the historical landscape of Viking activity in Ireland. Olaf and Ivar installed themselves as joint kings of Dublin, so establishing the Viking Kingdom of Dublin. They did this by driving the Danes out of the city. Although the possibility of Ivar's identification with the legendary figure Ivar the Boneless is still a matter of speculation, the brothers' principal purpose was to transform Dublin into a bustling commerce city and a strategic headquarters for raids across the British Isles. As a result of Dublin's rise to popularity, the city went from being a simple outpost for raiding to becoming one of the most profitable ports in the early medieval West. This signified a substantial and significant transition from its prior status. During the same time period, additional Viking longforts in Limerick, Waterford, Wexford and Cork saw significant expansion and economic prosperity. In order to take advantage of the political differences that existed within Ireland, Olaf and Ivar formed alliances with local rulers such as Cerbhal mac Dunlega of Osraig in order to fight against the High King Moll Shecknel. On the other hand, affiliations were not clearly demarcated along Irish Viking lines, and both factions were involved in complex political machinations. Through the establishment of a marriage contract, Olaf, Ivar and Cerbhal were able to strengthen their partnership, which may have been an indication that Olaf was married to one of Cerbhal's daughters. In the year 859, they demonstrated their ability to work together in the military by launching a campaign against the Fiorítag, the Kingdom of Meath, which was ruled by King Moll Shecknel. Their efforts weren't without controversy, despite the fact that they had some initial success. When Olaf and Ivar looted Neolithic burial mounds on the River Boyne in the year 863, they did an act that was so close to sacrilegious that it caused widespread outrage throughout Ireland on a national scale. During the year 864, a captured and blinded Lor Khan, which ultimately led to his abdication. This was a significant event that damaged the Norse position by eliminating one of their most important allies. This occurrence represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that existed at that period of time, so laying the groundwork for other conflicts and upheavals. In the wake of Lor Khan's fall from power, two Norwegian brothers named Olaf and Ivar rose to prominence as influential characters in the Norse leadership. They embarked on a mission to Scotland, which occurred across the Irish Sea. At this point, Finliath held the position of High King. Taking advantage of this chance, he robbed and destroyed the Norse longfort that was located in Ulster. While fighting the Norse at Loch Foyle, he was victorious and brought 240 of their heads back with him. After that, King Kenzing of Loikis, an ally of Olaf's, launched an assault and demolished the boundary fortification of Clontalkin, which was located only 5 miles away from Dublin City. By the year 853, they had taken possession of Dublin, which had previously been a simple outpost for raiding, and transformed it into a formidable power centre. It was the beginning of a new era in Ireland's Viking Age, when Dublin became a profitable trading port and a strategic hub for Viking voyages. This marked the beginning of the end of the Viking Age. On the other hand, their aspirations were met with strong obstacles in the form of the native Irish rulers, who were resolute in their efforts to thwart Norse expansion attempts. After launching numerous assaults and inflicting huge deaths among the Norse invaders, High King Finliath emerged as a powerful adversary to the Norse invaders. The tenacity and resolve of the indigenous soldiers was on full display during the conflicts that took place in the year 848, when Irish warriors were victorious over European Vikings. The Norse, who were accustomed to pillaging and plundering, found themselves confronted with stiff opposition by Irish warriors, who chose to gather the heads of their enemies rather than take prisoners. Among the dead, Olaf, one of Olaf's own sons, resolved to exact revenge on those who had been killed. In the year 869, he carried out a huge raid against Armagh, during which he looted the town and the temple complex and led away around 1,000 hostages. Olaf and Ivar proceeded to strengthen their authority over the Irish monarchy by forming alliances with Irish monarchs and conducting unrelenting raids across the Irish Sea, despite experiencing a number of setbacks and defeats. The reign of these individuals was not, however, without difficulties. Olaf's death in combat with King Constantine I of Scotland in 875 and Ivar's death in 873 both produced a power vacuum in Dublin, which paved the way for political instability and internal strife. Both of these events occurred shortly after one another. The political scene was further complicated by the fact that Danish Vikings took advantage of the chance to challenge Norwegian rule of Dublin while the situation was chaotic. The complicated dynamics of Viking authority in Ireland were highlighted by the shifting allegiances and power battles that occurred between Danish and Norwegian factions. In the meantime, Irish rulers took advantage of the weaknesses of the Norse through the formation of alliances and the initiation of planned assaults in order to recapture their kingdoms. In the year 902, King Cerval MacMurchan of Leinster and Moll Finnea of Berga launched a coordinated assault against the Norse stronghold in Dublin. This event proved to be the key turning point. It was the Irish forces' pincer attack that took the Norse off guard, which ultimately led to a stunning victory for the Irish army. The fall of Dublin was the event that brought an end to the first Viking Age on the island of Ireland, which was also the end of Viking dominance in Ireland. During the time that the Danes were pillaging England and France, Norse raids turned Ireland into a battlefield that was permanently engaged in conflict. Many ports, including Dublin, Limerick and Wexford, developed into Viking strongholds and thriving commercial cities during this time period. Slavery, on the other hand, was the principal business of the Vikings in Ireland, and they searched the area for captives in order to feed their trade. As a result of this, Irish kings became more aggressive, and many clans came together under the leadership of the High King in order to fight off Viking invasions. In spite of the fact that the Norse had the advantage of mobility with their longships, the Irish were able to resist their invasions by employing ambushes and taking surprise attacks. The beginning of the Viking invasions in Ireland began in earnest in the year 795, when the monastery on Rathlin Island was taken by Vikings. This event marked the beginning of a more turbulent age. Through the course of time, the Vikings established more permanent footholds along the coast of Ireland, which resulted in the development of fortified villages that were referred to as longforts. These longforts, which include those in Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick, have persisted as enduring relics of the presence of Vikings. Dublin, in particular, emerged as a significant trading hub, serving as a connection between Ireland and other Viking trading cities, like York and Dorestad. Although the Irish put up a fight, the Vikings persisted and continued to expand their colonies and their sphere of influence. The existence of Viking settlements in Ireland is supported by archaeological evidence, which includes the discovery of traces of longforts and other artefacts in the locations of Dublin and other locations. The fact that Dublin continued to grow even after the Vikings were defeated is evidence that there was already a significant Irish population in the city when the Vikings were defeated. Prior to the arrival of the Vikings, Ireland was not devoid of riches or commerce. Yet, the Vikings were responsible for bringing about substantial changes, such as the transformation of Dublin into a trading centre. Monasteries served as centres of scholarship and economic activity in Irish society, which contributed to the country's comparatively prosperous cultural environment. However, the Vikings brought a more negative component to Irish society, which was the institution of slavery. In the years leading up to the Viking invasions, the most common form of warfare in Ireland consisted on the robbery of animals rather than the sale of captives into slavery. In addition to their insatiable hunger for slaves, the Norse engaged in widespread slave trading, which contributed to the increased suffering that was caused by conflict. As a result of the Vikings' preference for the higher prices provided in countries such as Scandinavia, the Byzantine Empire, and the Arab Caliphates, captives were sold overseas. The Icelandic people brought with them the institution of slavery, which had a profound impact on the social and economic landscape of Ireland. It was frequently a precarious situation for Irish captives who were sold into slavery by the Vikings. Although their family were able to rescue some of them, the most of them were sold into slavery in faraway nations. With their amazing ships, the Norse travelled far and wide in order to collect and sell captives. The Viking slave trade was a lucrative activity that the Norse participated in. Relatives of the fortunate hostages were able to pay a ransom for them, while those who were unable to be ransomed were sold at auction overseas. There was a significant amount of activity in the slave trade between Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish kingdoms. Nonetheless, the Vikings generally chose the higher prices. They were able to acquire those things in the prosperous Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphates. It is quite probable that the majority of Irish prisoners were distributed either inside Scandinavia itself or among the luxurious towns of Muslim Spain or North Africa. The mainstream narrative that portrays the Vikings as advantageous to Ireland's economy through increased trade is challenged by John Haywood's distinct take on the impact of Viking presence in Ireland. Haywood's perspective challenges the usual narrative. Instead, Haywood contends that the widespread practice of slavery that was introduced by the Norse hints at a more negative aspect of the Norse's influence on Irish civilization. Specifically, Haywood provides two riveting accounts of persons who were taken captive by Viking slavers in order to highlight this point. In the first story, Saint Findan describes his adventures when his sister was taken captive by Norse pirates. As a result, he was able to negotiate for her release. Findan, on the other hand, was taken hold of and held captive on a Viking ship upon his arrival. Findan was eventually set free after being subjected to horrible conditions, which resulted in his experiencing starvation and thirst. On the other hand, he had other confrontations with Vikings, and in the end, he was sold into slavery and embarked on a trip that brought him to Rome. In a different tale, a man named Morhad was kidnapped and sold to a nunnery in Northumbria. While there, he was successful in seducing a number of nuns, which ultimately led to his exile and further adventures. Morhad was able to persevere in spite of the challenges he had, which resulted in him engaging in a number of adventures. One of these adventures was when he was sold to a wealthy widow in Germany. After that, he eventually went back to Ireland and reunited with his family. Through the use of these narratives, the victims of Viking slavery are brought into a more humane light, and the violence and exploitation that were endemic in the Norse slave trade are brought into focus. Although some people, such as Findan and Morhad, may have finally been able to achieve freedom, Haywood concedes that a great number of other people did not have the same good fortune, and were forced to endure lifelong servitude, or even worse. In addition, Hayward compares and contrasts the Viking conquests in Ireland with their victories in other places such as England, Scotland, and France. In contrast to these centralized kingdoms, where the rule of the Vikings was made easier by pre-existing power structures, the fractured political landscape of Ireland presented considerable hurdles to the Norwegians' ability to dominate the region. Because of the decentralized character of Irish governance, it was difficult for Vikings to maintain long-term dominance over the island. This was due to the fact that cooperation among various Irish monarchs was able to mount effective resistance against Viking raids. In addition, Hayward highlights the military prowess and tenacity of the Irish people throughout the medieval period. These individuals were able to muster a significant number of troops in order to avoid being attacked by Vikings. Irish chieftains were able to mobilize huge forces, despite the fact that their kingdoms were smaller than those of the Vikings. This made it difficult for the Vikings to negotiate peace or establish control over wide geographical areas. Norse raiders, who were frequently better equipped than their Irish counterparts, wore mail shirts and iron helmets. This was in contrast to the Irish, who relied on ambushes and hit-and-run strategies due to their lack of armour. This tactical disadvantage encouraged the Irish to strike opportunistically, striking Viking raiding parties that were exhausted and loaded with loot as they prepared to depart with their loot and hostages. Ring forts and other defensive buildings were scattered throughout the landscape in Ireland as a response to the threat posed by the Vikings. On the other hand, these defences were not sufficient enough to withstand the unrelenting attacks of the Norse. In spite of the fact that there were some stone fortifications, such as the Greenan of Ailach, the decentralised character of Irish political power made it difficult to mount an effective defence. These vulnerabilities were exploited by Norse invaders, who took advantage of the largely unguarded countryside of Ireland and struck fear into the hearts of the families and communities who lived there. The Norse activity switched towards England and France, where the Anglo-Saxons and Franks gained strength against the Northmen. This resulted in a temporary reprieve from the Viking raids that had been occurring, which occurred. Despite this, there was a resurgence of Viking interest in Ireland as a result of the loss of Norse power in these territories. According to Ragnald's building of a stronghold in Waterford in 914 and Sihtric One-Eyed's takeover of Dublin in 917, the Second Viking Age in Ireland began with internal Viking wars. This is proved by the fact that both of these events occurred. A coalition led by High King Njal was formed in order to combat the resurgent Viking menace. This coalition was formed as a result of the resurgence of Viking activity, which caused Irish kings to become frightened. The rousing speech delivered by Njal emphasised the urgency and desire of the Irish people to protect their homeland against intrusions from the Norse. The resiliency and determination of Ireland to resist foreign invaders remained unshakable, notwithstanding the difficulties that were presented by Viking assaults and internal disputes. It is important to note that the impact of Viking raids went beyond the realm of armed conflict. John Hayward, a historian, casts doubt on the idea that the Vikings were beneficial to Ireland since they opened up opportunities for trade with other countries. The principal activity of the Vikings in Ireland was the trading in slaves, despite the fact that they did bring new markets to the country. For Viking raids, the practice of slavery became a lucrative enterprise, and they took advantage of the large number of Irish prisoners for financial gain. The narratives of individuals such as Saint Findan and Morhad shed insight on the traumatic experiences of those who were captured by Viking slavers. Although the source materials provide little data concerning the fate of these captives, the accounts of these individuals throw light on the experiences. An example of the severity of the Viking slave trade is provided by the torture that St. Findan endured after being taken by Norse Vikings. In spite of the fact that he was eventually released, Findan's contacts with Viking invaders shed light on the ongoing danger that Irish towns were constantly confronted with throughout this unstable period. Morhaed's adventures, which include being sold to a nunnery, charming his captors, and eventually achieving freedom, do the same thing. They provide light on the tenacity and inventiveness of those who were entangled in the Viking slave trade. There were thousands of captives who were forced to live in servitude in faraway regions such as Scandinavia, Muslim Spain, or North Africa. While some captives, such as St. Findan and Morhaed, were able to escape or achieve freedom, others were forced to endure that fate. An important turning point in the ongoing conflict between the Norse invaders and the indigenous Irish was the Battle of Island Bridge, which took place close to the beginning of the 10th century. A decisive victory was gained by the Norse, led by Sihtric One-Eyed, which resulted in the deaths of 6 Irish rulers, including Niall Glundorf, who was the High King himself. A historian by the name of Lars Brownworth referred to it as the greatest severe loss that the Norse had ever inflicted against the Irish, which reinforced Dublin's position as a stronghold for the Vikings. After the Norse were victorious at Island Bridge, they immediately began a campaign to reassert their dominance throughout the coastal towns of Ireland. Thora Helgason was successful in re-establishing the Viking kingdom of Limerick in the year 922. At the same time, Norse soldiers were able to take Cork and Wexford. Their strategy, on the other hand, was centred on establishing small coastal bases that were well fortified rather than seeking to dominate large-scale territories. Dublin became the centre of Norse power in Ireland, and it dominated Dublinshire, which stretched from Wicklow in the south to Skerries in the north, with the Bordentary Cartizans for the River Liffey serving as the boundary to the east of the county. In order to gain a better understanding of the world via the perspective of maritime control, Sihtric One-Eyed, who was both pragmatic and merciless, left Dublin under the supervision of his cousin Gottfried while he went to York. Sihtric was able to succeed to the throne in York, and he proceeded to spend the subsequent 6 years strengthening Viking power throughout Northumbria. While this was going on, Gottfried was ruling Dublin with an iron grip, carrying out major slave raids across Ireland and sacking prominent locations such as Armagh. On the other hand, Gottfried's success was short-lived since Muirchertach ambushed him, which resulted in a devastating defeat for the Norse. One of the most significant events that occurred during Ireland's Second Viking Age was the defeat of Gottfried. The Irish resistance became more powerful as they adapted to the strategies used by the Vikings and made themselves a formidable danger to the raiding expeditions. The Irish were able to demonstrate their resiliency and efficiency against Norse forces by victories such as the Battle of Carlingford Lough in the year 925, which marked the beginning of a new phase of the fight. As a result of the century of Viking attacks, Irish society underwent significant changes, including the transformation of clans into more martial groups and the formalisation of the power of overkings. The dynamics of power and territorial control among Irish clans were transformed as a result of the adoption of Viking strategies, weapons, and violent combat methods. The use of swords and axes became increasingly common among Irish warriors. In Irish warfare, burning and pillage were mostly unknown previous to the arrival of the Vikings. However, after the Vikings arrived, the Irish embraced this strategy, even turning it against the Norse themselves. However, this more forceful technique of combat was also utilised by the Irish monarchs in their conflict with one another. Sitrick One-Eyed passed away in the year 907. Following Sitrick's passing, his kinsman Guthfrey set his sights on York with the intention of asserting his right to the seat of the ancient monarchy. On the other hand, Guthfrey's desires came into conflict with the increasing Anglo-Saxon authority under the rule of King Aethelstan. King Aethelstan immediately put an end to Guthfrey's ambitions and dismissed him from York. A shift in the balance of power in England was signalled by this disaster, which signified the unravelling of Dublin's rule over York. Olaf Guthridsson, Guthfrey's son, attempted to fill the power vacuum that was left behind after his father's death in 934. Meanwhile, Guthfrey's reign continued to be enforced in Dublin until his death. In the midst of internal struggle and competing claims to leadership, Olaf emerged victorious, establishing himself as the most powerful Viking monarch in Ireland. His rise to power marked the beginning of a new age in Dublin's Viking story, which was marked by growth and ambition. Olaf's aspirations went beyond the borders of Ireland. He had aspirations of retaking York and re-establishing his father's empire. His goals extended beyond the borders of Ireland. To bring this magnificent vision into reality, Olaf proceeded on a diplomatic mission, forming alliances with the powers that were located in the surrounding area. He was successful in securing the backing of Constantine, the King of Scotland, as well as Owen of Strathclyde, the ruler of Wales, thereby building a strong coalition that was already in a position to conquer. The painstakingly constructed plans that Olaf had devised were put into action in the year 937, when he was gathering his soldiers in preparation for the invasion of England. The extent of his military attempt was unparalleled, and Max Adam made a point of mentioning the astounding number of Olaf's assembled force, which was estimated to be somewhere over 8,000 strong, and was further strengthened by contingents arriving from Scotland and Wales. It is estimated that Olaf commanded a force of approximately 10,000 to 12,000 people, which included his Scottish and Welsh allies. Olaf, who had a great fleet at his disposal, set sail for the shores of England with the goal of capturing York as his prize. Olaf and his allies traversed dangerous waters, both literally and figuratively, during the course of the war, which was laden with danger and uncertainty all throughout. Their endeavour to capture York was not only a military operation. Rather, it was an attempt to restore lost glory and reassert Viking control over the heartland of the Anglo-Saxon civilization. As Olaf's fleet made a passage through the North Sea, despite the fact that they were facing opposition from both the friendly and hostile forces, the fate of nations hung in the balance. At the same time as Olaf's fleet was drawing closer to the coast of England, there was a mixture of excitement and dread, since the outcome of the upcoming conflict would determine the path that history would take. The Battle of York was a momentous occasion that would determine the destiny of kingdoms and the legacy of Viking power in the British Isles. It was looming huge on the horizon just before it was about to take place. The battle that took place between Olaf Guthrison's men and the defenders of York will be remembered as a battle between giants, a contest of power, strategy, and sheer determination. This battle will be recorded in the annals of American military history. As the fate of the world hung in the balance, the battlefield resounded with the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, and the cry of soldiers. An attempt was made by Olaf Guthridsson, the king of the Dublin Vikings, to broaden his sphere of influence and undo the triumphs that had been achieved by the dynasty of Alfred the Great in England. As a result of having access to a vast amount of resources, Olaf set out on an ambitious expedition with the intention of reclaiming lands that had been taken by the Anglo-Saxons. On the other hand, his ideas would soon be greeted with opposition from Aethelstan, a character who was renowned for his pedigree and his commitment to administration. Not only did Aethelstan acquire the abilities of a warrior throughout his childhood, but he also developed a profound dedication to the rule of law as a result of his upbringing under the guidance of his aunt, Lady Aethelfla of Mercia, and his father, King Edward the Elder. When Aethelstan learned that Olaf's coalition army had ravaged Mercia, he did not waste any time in beginning to organize his forces in order to combat the threat posed by the Vikings. Through the leadership of his brother Edmund, Aethelstan led a large army in the direction of the north, with the intention of directly confronting Olaf's men. Everything was in place for the illustrious Battle of Brunanburh, which was a defining moment in the history of the Viking Age. The Anglo-Saxon and Viking armies engaged in a furious and drawn-out fight that lasted throughout the day. They were positioned opposite each other in shield wall formations and engaged in combat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides a detailed description of the intensity of the conflict, which resulted in significant deaths on both sides. On the other hand, in the end, it was Aethelstan's men that emerged triumphant, inflicting a severe blow to Olaf's coalition. The aftermath of the conflict sent shockwaves through England and Ireland's entire population. As a result of Olaf's loss, Maciotach of the Leather Cloaks was able to completely take control of Dublin, which marked a significant shift in the power dynamics in the region. On the other hand, Olaf's efforts to re-establish his family's rule in York and Dublin were unsuccessful for a short period of time, since the Anglo-Saxon kingdom continued to be a serious competition. Olaf's death and the rise to power of new leaders like Olafur Sitreiksson and Blosha Guthrason both contributed to the continuation of the struggle for control. The Norse presence in Ireland endured despite the fact that it had experienced several defeats, which resulted in additional battles and alliances amongst competing clans. Notable individuals, such as Mahuirtach of the Leather Cloaks, were instrumental in rallying Irish armies against the Norse, which ultimately resulted in large fights and losses for both sides. When Congolech Noba was elevated to the position of High King of Ireland in 944, he wasted little time in retaliating against recent Norse conquests. During his invasion and subsequent sacking of Dublin, he caused the Norse to suffer hundreds of casualties. Due to the severity of the calamity that befell the Vikings, Blokera was forced to flee into exile. At York, the Norse were unable to maintain their resistance, and the English were able to beat and drive out Olaf Sitreiksson, who then escaped to Dublin. Olaf was able to seize authority in Dublin, but he was ultimately defeated by Conglach in the year 948. Gottfried, another of Sitric's sons with one eye, rose to greatness and became the next king of Dublin. Gottfried, like many other Viking commanders who came before him, began his authority with vast attacks, plundering the Irish Midlands in 951. Particularly noteworthy was the sacking of Kells, which was one of the cities that Gottfried pillaged. The Annals of Ulster provide a detailed account of the destruction that was caused by these attacks. They describe the capture of thousands of warriors and enormous valuables, as well as claims of divine punishment in the shape of illnesses that swept over Dublin, with King Gottfried being one among the victims of these epidemics. A change in the political dynamics of the region was brought about as a result of these events, which marked the beginning of a time of relative weakness for the Vikings in Ireland. While this was going on, Eric Bloodaxe was becoming a strong force in the history of the Vikings across the North Sea coast. In spite of the fact that Eric was born into a lineage of Norse kings, his rise to power was marred by treachery and bloodshed. It was because of his merciless consolidation of power and his proficiency in warfare that he was given the nickname Bloodaxe. Although Eric was king of Norway for a short period of time, he was sent into exile as a result of a rebellion that was led by his brother Håkon the Good. Eric continued his pursuit of domination, finally taking the crown of York in the midst of the political upheaval that was occurring in the northern region of England. He was unfazed by his removal from power. On the other hand, Eric's reign in York was short-lived, since the Anglo-Saxon resistance led by King Eadred had the objective of permanently removing Norse power from the province. As a result of Scottish incursions in Northumbria and Eadred's military campaign, Eric and his soldiers were compelled to retire, which resulted in the end of autonomous Viking control in York by the year 955. The incorporation of York and the regions of Danelaw by England marked the conclusion of the Viking Age in the region, and marked the beginning of a transition toward Anglo-Saxon dominance. Under Olav Sitricksson's leadership, Dublin went through its own transition at the same time that these other events were taking place. Olav, in contrast to his predecessors, chose to prioritize political connections and stability over the possibility of frequent raiding. By means of smart marriages and diplomatic operations, Olav was able to establish connections with the local aristocracy of Ireland. This allowed him to successfully navigate the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the political landscape of the region. To begin, Olaf wed Dunlaith, who was the sister of Domhnall I Niall, the High King who ruled from 956 to 980. He wed Gornflait, who was the daughter of Murhad Macfin, the King of Leinster, after Dunlaith had passed away. Gornflait was the daughter of Murhad Macfin. Throughout the course of his reign, Olav encountered a number of different Leinster rulers, including his father-in-law, the High King Domhnall, and a number of other individuals who held significant positions of authority. The death of Domhnall had occurred. The year 980 saw the ascension of Moll Shecnol Mac Domhnall become to High King. He was Dunlaith's son from a prior marriage. Moll Shecnol did not develop a strong fondness for the Dublin Vikings throughout his time king. A holy grove that had been dedicated to Thor was destroyed by fire by him in the year 975, which took place outside of the town. One of Olaf's goals was to learn more about the authority that the newly appointed High Monarch wielded. In the year 980, he was the one who established a coalition that consisted of Viking warriors from the coast of Scotland and the Hebrides Islands. It was necessary for Moll Shecnos to form their own army in order to join arms with Irish troops from Leinster and Ulster. The two of them met face to face. A hill known as Tara is home to a number of historical sites, including an ancient burial mound, the location of the Stone of Power, and the seat of Ireland's High Kings, according to legend. Upon the conclusion of the Battle of Tara, Moll Shecnol emerged victorious with a decisive victory, whilst Olaf was defeated in a manner that was extremely devastating. Not only is this conflict at issue, but after some time had passed, it became clear that Clontarf was the decisive victory that the Norse had been looking for in Ireland. The death of Olaf's eldest son and heir occurred in the middle of the chaos, which ultimately led to the breakup of the medieval Viking army. In the midst of Moll Shecnol's efforts to gain an advantage, he launched an assault on Dublin. As soon as the hour of 3 had passed during the course of several days, Olaf's capital was taken away. During the time that Olaf was able to flee into exile, Marl Sheknel was successful in obtaining a considerable tribute from the populace to pay. Despite this, Olaf did not make his escape by withdrawing to a nearby Viking fortress of his own accord. Instead, he made the decision to become a monk at Iona, which is also the location where he passed away. In most cases, the days when Norse invaders, such as Orgul the Devil, vandalized monasteries are no longer there. This is because monasteries have been destroyed. At this point in time, the Irish-Norse language had already established itself into the political, cultural, and even religious structures of Ireland. Due to the fact that this was of such monumental importance, a defeated Dublin Viking felt compelled to commit himself to the monastery as Gaelic. Once again, Dublin was controlled by an Irish monarch, but this time he had seized it from a Norse ruler who was at least allegedly Christian and related to Ireland's great dynasties through marriage. This time, Dublin was considered to be the capital of Ireland. In a twist of irony, Olaf's own son by Dunlathjana, Jana, who was also the High King's half-brother, embodied the mixing of all things Norse and Irish. Jana was given the responsibility of ruling on Sheknel's behalf in Dublin as his vassal. In addition to that, Jana was the High King's half-brother. His father was a well-known Viking explorer and conqueror, who had won a great deal of territory over the course of his life. His mother was born to the daughter of an Irish High Monarch, who was also the High Monarch's daughter. Is it possible that this would be the way that the Second Viking Age in Ireland would come to an end, with invaders and invaded coming together? The victory that Molsheknels had achieved at the Battle of Tara was ultimately unsuccessful, regardless of the circumstances. Dublin is a powerful independent metropolis that is in charge of running the country. Over the course of this period of time, the Norse were no longer able to exercise their own independent control on the island. Rather than that, they were involved in a conflict between the competing rulers of Ireland. The days when it seemed as though fierce warlords like Thorgil the Devil were capable of seizing control of the kingdom. Over the course of time, Ireland had completely disappeared. The Meath family was troubled by the fact that Meath, who had now firmly assumed the position of High King, was a relative threat that was somewhat difficult and peripheral. Mull Shacky's status as Ireland's most important monarch was reaffirmed by the ruling in the case of Tara. Brian Boru, the legendary King of Munster, emerged from lowly beginnings to become the most powerful monarch in the country. He was the younger son of a minor king who ruled in the rural southwest of Ireland. His upbringing was characterized by a number of distinguishing qualities, including education, exposure to the arts, and encounters with combat. Because Brian was raised in a monastery in Munster, he had a well-rounded education that included the opportunity to learn how to play the harp, a skill that would later become associated with Irish culture. Brian's upbringing in the monastery provided him with this opportunity. Also, he engaged himself in the study of Greek and Latin, and he found special inspiration in the writings of Julius Caesar, whom he admired for his strategic prowess and his ability to outmaneuver his opponents. He also studied Greek and Latin. Brian and his older brother, Mathgaman, were the ones who taught him the art of combat. This was a skill that would prove to be quite helpful in the difficult times that were to come. At their early engagements in war against the Limerick Vikings, particularly at the battles of Sulky and Limerick, Brian's developing leadership and strategic ability were on display. This was especially true during the battles of Limerick and Sulky. The Dalgash finally emerged victorious, regaining control of Limerick and consolidating their dominance in the region. This was accomplished in spite of earlier setbacks, such as Ivar's brief return of Limerick despite the fact that they had first been vanquished. After Matgoman's sudden death, the Dalgash dynasty was plunged into a political crisis, which resulted in their success being short-lived. However, their success was short-lived because of this. After being abruptly raised to the role of king, Brian unexpectedly found himself presented with the tremendous problem of maintaining order and establishing his authority over the volatile land. This was a difficulty that he had not anticipated. During the time when Brian was beginning his journey to become one of the most revered and celebrated kings in Ireland, he would soon be met with a number of challenges that were on the horizon. Both his capabilities and his leadership qualities would be put to the test by these types of situations. One of the most significant moments in the history of the region was when Brian Boru rose to power. The year 977 saw the beginning of Brian's meteoric ascent to prominence, which began with his decisive victory over the Viking chieftain Ivar at Scattery Island. Through the application of the strategic expertise that he had gained from the Vikings themselves, Brian was able to swiftly cement his position, as well as eliminate competitors and increase his influence. In the year that followed, Brian's claim to the throne of Munster was strengthened by the defeat of Malmone, the person responsible for the murder of his brother. On the other hand, his ascent to power was greeted with hostility by both Irish and Viking factions, who were concerned about his expanding authority. An alliance was made between Donoban of the Iffienti and Harold, the son of Ivar, with Limerick serving as their base. This alliance was formed in an effort to undermine Brian's status as the dominant figure. On the other hand, Brian demonstrated his worth once more during the decisive Battle of Cahir in the year 978. He was successful in destroying the coalition and established Limerick as an important bastion for his dynasty. At the same time that Brian expanded his power over places that were traditionally associated with the Vikings and strengthened his dominance over adjacent territories, his ambition had no limitations. According to Mal Shacknall, the High King of Ireland, Brian's expansionist policies gained him the animosity of Mal Shacknall, who made it his mission to obstruct Brian's goals at every opportunity. Unfazed, Brian continued his campaigns, which included raids in the counties of Leinster, Meath and Connaught, as well as the deployment of Viking fleets to wreak havoc on the territories of his Irish enemies. It was impossible to deny Brian's control by the year 996, as even the King of Leinster acknowledged his power. The following year, Brian was able to obtain the ultimate reward by compelling Mal Shacknall to acknowledge his supremacy. As a result, he effectively became the independent master of the southern half of Ireland. His rise to high kingship, on the other hand, was not without its difficulties, as he faced persistent opposition from individuals such as Mal Morda of Leinster and Cetric Silkbeard of Dublin. The united uprising that occurred in the year 999 posed a huge threat to Brian's reign. Nonetheless, his tactical brilliance was successful, which led to a decisive victory that further strengthened his power. In spite of his successes, Brian was confronted with persistent opposition, which culminated in a conspiracy that was hatched by his adversaries with the intention of destroying him completely. Cetric was granted permission to continue his rule in Dublin. Nevertheless, he was required to take an oath of allegiance to Brian. As a result of the battle, Brian's reputation was enhanced even further, and he gradually surpassed the former High King of Ireland. In the year 1002, Brian had the confidence that he was capable of assuming the High Kingship itself from Malachnal. As a result of this humiliation, Malachnal has developed an unwavering hatred for Brian. A covert communication was made between the former High King and Sihtric Silkbeard. The Leinster faction was equally eager to see Brian collapse together, and they continued to be so. Brian's adversaries deliberated and deliberated over their next move. They intended to bring about Brian Boru's complete and utter ruin. Brian Boru was at the centre of the storm, navigating the hazardous waters of medieval Irish politics with skill and resolve. As tensions mounted, Ireland geared itself for additional battle at the same time. In the year 1005, Brian Boru embarked on a voyage to the monastery of Armagh, which is widely regarded as the holiest location in Ireland, with the intention of paying a visit to the burial site of St. Patrick. One of Brian's ultimate objectives was to establish a unified kingdom in Ireland, with himself serving as the king of that realm. The purpose of this pilgrimage was to act as a representation of his ultimate goal. Putting 20 ounces of gold on the altar and signing his name in the record book of the cathedral as Imperator Scotorum, Brian made a grand gesture that declared him to be the Emperor of the Irish. He did this by depositing the money on the altar. In contrast, Brian's objectives were greeted with significant opposition by rival factions, both Irish and Viking, who were concerned about his growing authority. These factions were concerned about growing Brian's dominance. In the year 1014, Sihtric Silkbeard and his followers came to the realization that they have the self-assurance to oppose Brian's authority. The way in which they accomplished this was by recruiting Viking soldiers from other countries in order to bolster their ranks. Broda, who arrived in Dublin with a substantial Norse force prior to Easter, was one of the individuals who made this journey. Norsemen such as Sigurd of Orkney were also present. Brian assembled his own vassals and Viking allies, who included Broda's brother Ospak, in order to get ready for the pivotal Battle of Clontarf. This occurred at the same time that tensions were mounting. The struggle, which is typically depicted as a conflict between Brian Boru and the Viking invaders who travelled to Ireland, was far more intricate than a basic clash between two opposing forces. The Viking invaders went to Ireland. The intricate web of relationships and allegiances that existed during the battle led to Irish and Vikings fighting on both sides of the conflict. This was a result of the multifaceted nature of the struggle. On Good Friday, April 23, 1014, the two armies met in Clontarf, which is situated a few miles north of Dublin. This was the area where the military clash took place. In the event that Dublin was beaten, Sihtric Silkbeard remained at the city's walls, where he watched the battle to ensure that he would be able to keep control of the city. During this period, Brian, who was roughly 70 years old at the time and was no longer able to directly participate in the conflict, remained inside his war tent, with his son Murad leading his command. Murad was in charge of Brian's command. Estimates suggest that Brian may have had the numerical advantage over the other army. Nonetheless, there is still a lack of clarity over the specific size of the two forces. At the outset of the conflict, there were some formalities that were followed by designated champions engaged in single combat. Nevertheless, they ultimately ended up losing to both sides involved in the conflict. During the subsequent war, the two armies participated in a combat that was fought primarily on foot. They utilized a traditional shield wall formation, which consisted of spears being ready and shields being raised while the conflict was taking place. There was no let-up in the fighting, and neither side allowed itself to give ground without a fight. In spite of the fact that the Leinster coalition first made headway, Brian's soldiers eventually managed to rally support for one another and drive their foes back. Murad, the son of Brian, is said to have been responsible for the deaths of 100 men via his own strokes. This is said to have occurred when he was riding a white horse and brandishing a sword in each hand. At long last, the showdown that had been planned between Murhad and Sigurd took place. Murhad was able to rip Sigurd's helmet off of his head with one of his swords, and with the other blade, he was able to slash Sigurd's throat open. Both of these feats were accomplished by Murhad. Nearly instantaneously, Sigurd went away, thereby bringing to actuality at least a portion of the prophecy that was contained inside the Raven Banner. Despite the fact that the Battle of Clontarf was fought with the intention of removing the power of the Vikings, it was also fought with the intention of selecting who would become the High King of Ireland. A dispute between competing Irish factions took place at Clontarf, the scene of the combat. Each of these factions deployed their own Viking buddies in an effort to force their will on the situation. Clontarf became the setting for the conflict. Despite the fact that the war's completion meant that Brian would continue to hold his position as the de facto ruler of Ireland, it did not bring an end to the challenges that were present in Irish politics at the time. The fact that two of Brian's grandsons were slain in the war has brought to light the high stakes that were involved in the conflict. It is crucial to note that Brian's success was tempered by the fact that two of his grandkids were killed in the struggle. During the time that Ireland was transitioning into a new era under the leadership of Brian Boru, the memory of the Battle of Clontarf continued to have a significant impact on the political landscape of the island for many decades to come. During the course of the region's history, the rise to power of Brian Boru is considered to be one of the most crucial moments. It was in the year 977 that Brian's spectacular rise to notoriety began, which began with his decisive victory over the Viking chieftain Ivar at Scattery Island. This victory marked the beginning of Brian's meteoric rise to prominence. Brian was able to fast solidify his position, eliminate competitors, and enhance his influence by applying the strategic expertise that he had received from the Vikings themselves. This allowed him to achieve all of these goals. A year later, Brian's claim to the throne of Munster was bolstered by the defeat of Mal Moin, the person guilty for the murder of his brother. Mal Moin was the person responsible for the murder of Brian's brother. However, his rise to power was met with resistance from both Irish and Viking factions, who were concerned about his rising authority. This was due to the fact that they were frightened about his expanding influence. It was decided that Limerick would serve as the base of operations for the alliance that was formed between Donovan of the Ifienti and Harold, the son of Ivar. An effort was made to weaken Brian's position as the main figure, and this alliance was formed to accomplish so. On the other hand, Brian once again displayed his worth during the critical Battle of Cahir, which took place in the year 978. He was successful in defeating the coalition, and Limerick became a significant bastion for his dynasty as a result of his efforts. Not only did Brian increase his influence over regions that were traditionally linked with the Vikings, but he also strengthened his dominance over territories that were adjacent to his territory. His ambition was unbounded. Brian's expansionist tactics, according to Mal Shacknall, the High King of Ireland, earned him the hostility of Mal Shacknall, who made it his mission to impede Brian's ambitions at every chance. Mal Shacknall's actions were a direct result of Brian's expansionist policies. Despite the fact that he was unfazed, Brian maintained his campaigns, which included raids in the counties of Leinster, Meath and Connaught, as well as the deployment of Viking fleets to wreak havoc on the territories of his adversaries in Ireland. By the year 996, it was difficult to reject Brian's dominance, as even the King of Leinster accepted and acknowledged his power. This made it impossible to refute Brian's control. In the year that followed, Brian was successful in obtaining the ultimate reward by successfully convincing Mal Shacknell to accept his superiority against him. Because of this, he effectively elevated himself to the position of independent master of the southern part of Ireland. On the other hand, his ascent to high kingship was not without its challenges, as he encountered continuous opposition from individuals such as Malmorda of Leinster and Sitric Silkbeard of Dublin. His climb to high kingship was not without its obstacles. Despite the fact that the United Rebellion that took place in the year 999 posed a significant threat to Brian's reign, his tactical brilliance was successful, which resulted in a decisive victory that further cemented his control. Brian was met with relentless opposition, which resulted in a conspiracy that was devised by his rivals with the purpose of entirely destroying him. This occurred despite the fact that Brian had achieved a great deal of success. Sitric was granted permission to continue his authority in Dublin. However, in order to do so, he was compelled to take an oath of allegiance to Brian. As a consequence of the conflict, Brian's fame was elevated to an even greater degree, and he progressively eclipsed the prior High King of Ireland. In the year 1002, Brian felt certain that he was competent to take over the High Kingship from Malachnal, even though he had no prior experience in the position. This humiliation has caused Malachnal to acquire an unyielding hatred for Brian, and it has only grown stronger over time. During the course of their covert conversation, the former High King and Sitric Silkbeard exchanged information. Additionally, the Leinster faction remained ready to witness Brian's downfall as a group, and they continued to harbour this desire. In order to choose their next move, Brian's adversaries deliberated repeatedly. They had the intention of bringing about Brian Bodu's total and utter demise. When it came to navigating the treacherous seas of medieval Irish politics, Brian Boru was at the heart of the storm. He did so with confidence and determination. Ireland was preparing itself for extra combat at the same time that tensions were rising across the country. As the clash of arms reached its crescendo, a Viking spear found its mark in Mohad's belly, bringing the young warrior to his knees. Yet, in a display of defiance and determination, Mohad summoned his last ounces of strength to retaliate, wresting the Viking's mailcoat and delivering 3 fatal blows to his assailant's chest. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as described or was embellished by the passage of time, its symbolism echoed through the annals of Irish lore. Sigurd's demise proved to be the turning point in the battle. With their leader fallen, the rebel shield wall crumbled under the relentless onslaught of Brian Boru's army. Chaos engulfed the battlefield as Boru's forces pursued their fleeing adversaries, cutting down Norsemen as they attempted to escape to the safety of their ships in Dublin Bay. Amidst the carnage, a small band of Vikings, led by Broda, breached enemy lines and infiltrated Brian's tent, where the aged High King knelt in prayer. Mistaking Brian for a monk, most of the Vikings hesitated, but Broda, recognizing his target, swiftly dispatched the Irish king with a single stroke of his axe. Despite Brian's death, his army emerged victorious. All Viking mercenaries captured were summarily executed, their fate sealed in the aftermath of battle. Sitric's foresight in maintaining Dublin's neutrality proved prescient, sparing the city from the ravages of war. Yet, the toll of Clontarf was staggering. Brian's eldest son, along with 2 grandsons, a nephew, brother, and numerous Irish nobles, lay among the fallen. Ospak, Broda's brother and occasional ally, met his end on the battlefield as well. The aftermath of Clontarf spelled the decline of Dalgash power. Brian's younger son ascended to the throne, but proved incapable of filling his father's formidable shoes, leading to the collapse of the once mighty empire. Baru's hard-won hegemony dissolved into dust, a fleeting legacy overshadowed by the cost of victory. Amidst the chaos and bloodshed, it was the aloof leaders who emerged triumphant. Marshacnell reclaimed the High Kingship of Ireland, while Sitrick retained control of Dublin, his position largely unscathed by the tumultuous events of Clontarf. Though no longer a centre of power, Dublin remained the foremost port in Ireland, a testament to Sitrick's astute stewardship. His wealth and influence continued to grow, evidenced by the exorbitant ransom he paid for his son's release, and his founding of Christ Church Cathedral upon his return from pilgrimage. Yet, Sitrick's journey was not destined to end in peace. In 1035, Ecmarcof MacCraghniel of the Hebrides seized Dublin, forcing Sitrick into exile. The once mighty ruler met his demise while on another pilgrimage to Rome. For centuries following the Battle of Clontarf, Dublin remained a coveted prize, its control hotly contested by various Irish kings. While Norsemen would occasionally regain dominance over the city, they were not the same Vikings who had first arrived on Ireland's shores. By the 11th century, the Norsemen of Ireland had undergone a profound transformation. No longer were they the pagan raiders of old. Instead, they spoke Gaelic, embraced Christianity, and were predominantly of mixed Irish and Norse descent. The once commonplace pagan funerary rites had given way to Christian practices, marking a significant shift in cultural identity. Despite these changes, the Norse retained their maritime prowess, and their fleets continued to be valued assets among Ireland's kings. Yet, distinguishing between Irish and Norse became increasingly challenging as the two cultures intertwined. Abroad, the Norsemen of Ireland became known as Ostmen, men of the East, a testament to their distinct identity within the broader Scandinavian world. The legacy of the Vikings in Ireland, as historian Lars Brownworth notes, is a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy. While they established Ireland's great commercial cities and contributed to the country's economic growth, their reputation as brutal raiders was well deserved. The violence wrought by the Vikings led to the deaths of countless Irish men, women, and children, while many more suffered in the horrors of the slave trade introduced by the Norsemen. Indeed, slavery, which had largely died out during the age of St. Patrick, was reintroduced to Ireland by the Vikings and flourished in the post-Viking era. The Church condemned this practice, invoking the memory of St. Patrick's own enslavement as a poignant reminder of its cruelty. It was not until 1171, with the arrival of English armies in Ireland, that the Irish hoped for an end to the slave trade, viewing the English as potential liberators despite the complexities of their presence. Despite the hardships inflicted by the Vikings, perhaps the most enduring legacy of their era was the city of Dublin itself. Over the centuries, Dublin continued to thrive as a centre of trade and commerce, renowned for its luxury goods and bustling port. It was the Norse who introduced coinage to Dublin, laying the foundation for the city's prosperity and attracting merchants from far and wide. The 11th century marked the end of the Viking Age throughout northwestern Europe, as the Norse adapted to the territories they had invaded and embraced Christianity. This period witnessed the rise of Latin Christendom as a dominant force in the Mediterranean world, with populations growing, wealth increasing, and military power on the rise across the Latin West. These changes reverberated in Ireland, shaping its political and cultural landscape